Today we're going to be working on a landscape painting, and the first thing I want you to think about is that you may want to prepare your masonite board with a little bit of color in advance and have let it dry for a few hours if you're using oil paint. If you're using acrylic paint, you can just put a little thin wash over the top and it'll dry in about 20 minutes. Having that color underneath, you want to select a color that contrasts with the scene that you're looking at. In my case, I'm looking at a relatively green and gray scene of Elon's Lake Marynell. So I have my pink down to sort of contrast, to create a complement to all that green that'll be in the composition that I work on. The next thing I want to do is to think about putting down my sketch. Now, you might want to start with a sketch in your sketchbook with small thumbnails, figuring out which is the best angle. It's really a good idea to have an area of convergence within your picture. This might be a path that gets narrower, the edge of a water line, which is what I'll be using today. It might be the scale of things getting progressively smaller in the deeper space. And it also might involve having your marks become larger at the bottom, smaller as it moves higher on the picture plane. Remember, our word picture plane refers to the box that is created by the edge of your composition. So I'm going to start, as we usually do, with a little bit of yellow and orange to sketch on. I'm going to make that really thin and washy, and I'm going to put that sketch on and just try out one of my compositions. So I'm going to put the edge of the shore and the edge of the water and a couple of trees. And I'm just kind of working really loosely with a sketch without worrying too much about accuracy. And it looks like I have another tree over here, and it's going to be there, and I've got a couple other trees in the deeper space down here, and I've got the back edge of our water. Now you can see how that looks. Now, if I like this, this is fine, but what if I don't like it? Remember that all these sketches can always be modified. So the first thing I'm going to do is go back and change the things I don't like. I don't want this tree directly in the center, so I'm going to wipe it out and move it over a little bit to the left. And if I want to, I can even change up the color. Now you might say, oh man, she's changing it from the way it is naturally, but I promise you no one will ever come back to check. So draw it where it works for your picture and worry less about accuracy to Lake Marynell. All right, so now I have my trees in, and I have a couple things planned out, and I've moved my tree from here over to there just to resolve that compositional problem. Putting things in the center of a composition, generally we call it dead center for a reason. It's kind of a dead part of the composition, and optically it's not as pleasing as if you scoot it just a little to the left or the right. So I'm presuming that I am looking through a framework of sorts that's created by two of the trees. The other thing I think I want to do is to push this tree a little higher in the picture plane. So I'm also going to squash that up a little bit. I'm just taking a damp towel to scooch that up. The next thing I want to think about is, where are the dark and lights in this composition? And so I'm going to take a little water on my brush and a little bit of brown, and I'm going to start and mark off all the things that are in shadow in my composition. So I have an element there, and an element there, and there. I have a tree over here with a shadow, and a tree back there with a shadow, and I have the edge of the water is dark, and I have the side of a tree over here, and a little bit of the side of the tree on that side. And I've got the edge of the water here, and the edge of the water there. And where else is dark? Let's see. I'm going to presume a little bit and say there's going to be a dark there, and there, and there, and there. So I've added in some of the dark values on my trees. and added in a little bit of the dark shadows present in the scene. The next thing I want to think about is there's all this gorgeous reflection that's on the water right now, and it has a kind of arcing curve that shows the movement of the water. It also conveys where there are shadows in the deep space cast onto the water itself. I'm going to go ahead and mark the fountain. Often when people are beginners, they think that the fountain is blue. Let me tell you, that fountain is white. So I'm going to put it in right where it is, and right where it seems to belong in the composition. That might be a little bit large, so I'm going to go back to my damp paper towel and shrink it down just a little bit so it's not quite such a spectacular fountain, although Elon would love to think about it that way. All right, so now we have our fountain in the deep space. The next thing I want to look at is the color of the water, and I want to choose a fairly bright color, and I want it to be fairly pale because I want that high level of contrast in the near space. So I'm going to put a little bit of the reflection from that fountain and a bit of very true white, and moving along here. Now you'll notice I'm not making all of the water blue because the water really isn't very blue. It's actually pretty gray. The other place that I see an area of light is over on this side. So I'm going to put some white over there. So I'm sort of starting off with my highlights to sit. Next, I want to think about where there is light areas in the deepest space on the far side of the lake. And in looking at this, I see that there's an area there and a there and there. You'll notice that I'm not using a super blue color, but in fact using sort of a dull gray. And the reason for that is I want that part of the lake to really sink away in my composition. And I want the brighter colors to be at the lower part of the picture plane. So my bright colors are going to be down here, my dull colors are going to be up here. Let's see. On the left-hand side of the lake, it's fairly dark. And again, I want it to be a dark and dull color. So I'm going to try to make a sort of a dark gray blue, blue for the cooling, brown and gray for the deeper space. And because that area is in more shadow. Got a little bit of nature here, enjoying the space. You are lovely, and I would like to paint your picture. Oh dear, I see trouble ahead. All right, moving across my water, I want to think about making my water a lot of separate little marks, not one single shade. And because we have some movement in the water, I really want to play up the strong sense of curve about it. So we're going to have some lines that come through, and they're going to arc around like that, and arc and arc and arc and arc and arc and arc and arc, 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 and arc. And coming over on this side, we got a little bit more of that green. And again, it's in the lower part, so it can be a little bit brighter. I think that's right there is going to be too bright for that spot, so I'm going to peel it out and switch to a duller color. Because I want to progressively go from bright at the bottom to dull at the top. going to go with a slightly warmer color, brighter color, as this water comes closer to me back here. All right. And I want to pick up a little bit of that color on the opposite side of the tree, just so that I know that we read as part of the same passage of space. Now you can tell that I'm painting fairly thick. If you wanted to, you could choose to have your trees and landscape put together with palette knife if you prefer. Some people like to work with palette knife on trees. I'm going to also use some similar colors to the water, but I want to change it up just a little bit, making it slightly more green on my tree trunks, or slightly more brown on my tree trunks as well. And I want to think about lights coming from here, so we know it's going like this direction. So I want to make sure everything is dark on the right-hand side. Now, a lot of times people can think about how the landscape is predominantly green, but in fact, at this time of the year, it really has more of a brown tone to it. I'm going to use a little bit of this red-brown on my near trees as a way to sort of imply they're forward of our water. Again, using warm and cool colors to create depth of field and space. I also want to do my best to look at the actual form of trees. Trees have a lot of variety within them. Each species has different ways that it arcs or curves or creates new splits or branches. And I want to be true to that as I'm painting. Sometimes you can find that your trees start to look alike, and you want to think about how is this tree and its bark different from the next one. Arc this over the top, and that one over the top there, and that one up there. It's also good to talk to yourself while you're working. Don't worry about whether your trees are exactly what you're working from, because honestly, no one will go back and check. All right, in my deeper space, I have a number of small trees back here. And Elon has thoughtfully spread them out over the space. I am going to throw some very violet gray trees in that deeper space, because I feel like that's kind of the color that's happening back there, and that it will in fact sink them into the space a little bit. So I'm going to throw some lighter and more spaced out trees back there. Now, the other thing I'm noticing on here is, along with this white fountain, which is so bright, that we might have a little bit of an indent at the base of it just to create that space. It's very bright blue, so I want to think about bringing some of that blue lower down here, not to create a blue water, but really to create a water that is dappled with color. I do wish I had a way to hold these ducks in place. I would paint one in a minute, because they might be really fun. Now, one thing I did before I began, because it can be cold or buggy or hot and sweaty outside, whenever I work on a landscape, I try to stop in the studio and make as many shades of gray, green, violet, brown that I can think of in advance, just as we did when we worked with palette knife. The advantage of that is that you can, in fact, come up with a really nice color scheme in advance while still mixing some of those colors together as you go along to create new shades. So you'll see that I've already made quite a few violets, purples, grays. One thing you might want to play around with is what kinds of textures can be created with your brush stroke. You may want to put your brush strokes in multiple directions. You may want to use sort of dots as a way to create a texture or a pattern. You may want to come back with light on certain parts of things. Maybe there's moss or other organic forms. You might also want to try using the back of your brush to create line. You can see how that sgraffito technique creates a really sharp line that makes it very stark. It makes it a little artificial. I'm not sure I like that, but it does help me sort of organize things a little bit. And then maybe I can come back and adjust that. By using sgraffito over a colored surface, the colored surface comes through more. I'm using one of the stiffer brushes, and the reason for that is it tends to drag when you're putting your colors down and creates a little bit more interest in the outcome of your painting in terms of the light and the dark. Now, one thing many students have a tendency to want to do is they think, I'm going to put this giant field of blue down and then I'm going to paint my trees over the top. And I really discourage you from going that route. When you do that, your trees will look sort of pasted on and the paint itself will not look as good. So while it's one thing to put a tone down under your painting, that's fine. Don't be thinking that you're going to paint the grass and then the trees on top and the sky and the trees on top of that. And while you're at it, I use the analogy, if you were painting a picture of your room, would you start with your floor and then paint your bed over the top and then the top sheet and then the quilt on top of that and then the pillows on top of that? No, paint the things where they are, and don't worry about whether or not you have the perfect neatness for your trees. I really like this pattern that's present in the water. I'm going to see if I can make it using sgraffito here. Sort of like that. I don't know. It's a little different. Kind of creates a sawtooth pattern that follows in curves, and I like the way that looks, so I'm going to try to get that into my painting in some way. It's not a requirement, but it's something you may want to think about. Now, I've worked on the water a little while and I've worked on my trees a little while. The next thing I want to think about might be to put in some of my grass, because it's important that you bounce around in your painting as you're working on it and don't do just one thing at a time or one perfect tree. It kind of blocks you in for making decisions later on when you're trying to figure out how to make this painting. So I know that each of my trees has a kind of straw at the bottom, and the straw is a little bit on the rusty colored side. It's that pine straw that the South really loves to use. So I'm going to put a little bit of this pine straw in the front space of the nearest tree, and a slightly duller form of that pine straw in the next space back, and an even duller form of that. Now, when I say duller, I've added a little more brown, a little more white to kick the pine straw back in the space. So you can see as I'm going higher on the picture plane, I'm trying to make my pine straw not nearly as bright because I'm trying to get it to go back in the space instead of being upright and tilted at us. And then back to the brightest color of the pine straw. I'm going to put it right in the front. Remember when we painted donuts and we were trying to make them go round in a curve? Pine straw works the same way. You want your brightest color in the front, and you want your duller color at the back, and that's what's going to make your pine straw turn around the space. Also keep in mind that if there is a shadow next to your pine straw or over your pine straw, that you're going to want a deeper color of red where that shadow is. And I've got one right here, and I'm going to mix it with some brown. And on this one, I'm going to do the same thing. And at the base of the pine straw is kind of a dark line where it meets the grass. So I'm going to add that in too. And I'm even throwing a little blue in there just because it's sort of electric with the red. Actually, it was by accident, but that's okay. Next, what could I do to make that pine straw look better? I might try using the sgraffito again. Do I like that? No, not really. Let's try something else. How's about a little bit of small strokes going in different directions? That might represent the pine straw pretty well. And small strokes here. Maybe I'll even take a smaller brush and come back over the pine straw and pick out some bright colors right at the front and run that off the page at the bottom of the page. So you can see brighter here, a little duller here, and duller back there. Working with that. And then as I go back in the spaces back here, we also have more of that pine straw, and I'm going to just pop in a little bit as we go further back and further back. And there's a little bit on the far side of the lake, and I'm going to put in a little bit of that pine straw stuff there, and a really dull form of it back here. You sort of carry it through the composition. And a little bit right over here. All right. Now that we've dealt with the pine straw, we want to think about the green grass. See how little green is actually in this composition. The first thing I want to think about is what is my brightest and warmest shade of green, and to put that at the bottom inch of my composition because I know that that is the nearest element to me. So I'm going to use a very neon shade of green. I know you're going, too bright, but maybe not, maybe not. Let's see what's happening. I don't like that brush, so I'm going to switch brushes here. This one will be better. So my brightest shade of green down here at the bottom. And as I go further back in the picture plane, I'm going to find a color that is slightly more bluish. And back from there, this is really artificial looking. Maybe I can mix it with the previous one and get something that's halfway between. I'm also going to remember that I got a couple shadows going on in this, so maybe I just want this for the lightest areas. Never hurts to have a little brown mixed in. And then further back from that, I want something that is duller and possibly a little, that might be too blue. All right, we'll wipe that off and try a little different color. All right, how about that one right there? That's better. A little bit bluer. And again, I'm working across the picture plane. Not with the direction. And as I go back into this space here, my green is going to get duller and duller and a little bit duller yet. And when we get to the far side of the lake, I'm going to have my green be very cool, very much in the blue realm, and very much in the deep space. Now you can see the progression from here to here, and that's what we're trying to create, that depth of field. Now the other thing that's on the other side of the lake is there is a green tree that's back behind here. It has a very contrasting green color. It has a certain freshness about it, and I'm going to use this green here to peep through and show the brightness of that tree that's behind. And is there anything else? There's a pine tree over here, and I'm going to put a few dots of that same green. If you're using a green in one particular place, I want you to think about using it in a second place, even though it doesn't necessarily always be absolutely accurate to what you're looking at. Oh, I guess I've got this grass over here, so I better put that in. And I'll put that along there. And the next thing I want to think about is there's a road. Believe it or not, there's a road back there, and it runs right here and right here and back there and there. So I'm going to try to put that road in there. And I'm going to make up a white and just run a line. Not too bad. All right, and maybe it appears in a couple other spots. There, and there, and there, and there, and there. All right, so we have the road. There's a sky element behind here where the stadium is. And I am going to mark off where I see the sky happening in my composition. And it looks like it runs behind the trees up in here. So everything up to that is going to have a kind of gray, blue, or violet kind of quality. And it's going to be relatively soft focus because it's in the deeper space. So let's make up some gray. And we're going to put some gray in there. And we're going to have some gray above our trees here. And we're going to have a little bit of gray above the pink trees. And looks like a little bit of gray back there. And while we're at it, a slight bit of olive up in here and here. And I'm going to come back and hit this with a little bit more olive as well. Now, while I'm going along, I know that my tree here reflected down into the water. And so I'm going to pick up a little bit of that color down into our water. Below. And I'm going to go back to my original trees. I'm trying to move all around the composition. And I'm going to put in a little of that olive. That might not be dark enough. I might have to go with a dark olive. Let's try that. That's a little better. Olive in the lower composition. What about when the light moves or the shadows change? I suggest actually painting the shadows in one fell swoop, and then as they move around, don't worry about it. Just move on. If the shadows come back, take that opportunity to adjust your shadows, but as you're going along, keep in mind that all shadows change. Another bit of advice would be to try to paint, if you're going to do this over several different days, to go out and paint at about the same time each time. So that's really helpful as you're going along. If you try to do your painting at noon one day and at 6 o'clock the next, your shadows are going to be all topsy-turvy, and you might find that really disconcerting. Now I'm going to put a couple of these deep space trees in. And in fact, I'm going to make them really dark blue, just so they'll sink in the space. And I just think they would be really effective to be really dark back there. And I know they're not that blue, but that's okay. I'm just going to do it. And remember, I said I like that sort of sawtooth shape that was going on in the water. I'm going to try to capture that down here. And each time I add a color to my water, I want to think about whether it's a bright color and would it be better represented at the bottom of the water or at the top, because of course we know that our more intense and contrasty colors need to be in this foreground space, and that things are going to fuzz out a little bit as we go back. And I'm just sort of tinkering with my water space to try to create that sort of sawtooth pattern that I was observing a little while ago, because I thought that was especially pretty. And I'm just going to let the colors sort of mix as I go along. All right, now I'm going to go back to my water and try to pick up the dark lines that are created by those trees from above the shoreline. We have several of them. And it's really important that we try to show that water as a reflective source. And I'm going to also put the water, that line back in that creates the difference in the road. So I'm going to try to add that in right over the top. When you paint wet on a wet area, you just want to be one stroke and not mess with it. So, and then wipe your brush off, pick up more paint, one stroke, one stroke. I'm going to go back and look at our fountain a little bit more. And again, as you're putting it in on this wet paint, a single stroke is plenty. And now I know I have some trees over here that are very pink, and I'm going to make a really sweet little pink, and that's not pink enough. I'll have to up that pink, given that I already have a pink composition going underneath. And a little bit of some brown to show the base of those. try to create a real deep space color using little bits of this aqua. And let some of that aqua come down into our water as well. Now you can see I'm fussing over this water quite a bit, and part of that is because the water is the most beautiful part of this whole scene. The grass and the trees are pretty generic, but the water itself is really pretty interesting. So I want to make sure that I do an especially good job on that part and really pay attention to that element. And as I'm going along, I'm looking up here to see whether or not some of these things here can be altered. And I use that sgraffito technique to create texture within these little plants up here. Maybe I want a smaller brush. Let me see if I've got a really teeny tiny brush. That might be my smallest one, but let me see. Have I got a smaller brush? No, not seeing it. All right, we'll just go with this one here. All right, to wrap up this baby, I'm going to put the sky in and call it a day. And again, don't be imagining that skies are always blue or that skies are always, super vivid. Sometimes a really white sky can, in fact, work better for your final product. So I'm going to put in a fairly dull gray sky here. And I'm going to paint it around my trees. So not underneath and then paint trees over the top, but rather I want to make this sort of have this feeling of standing out from the background. And we'll throw that in here. And whether these are happy trees or not, I do not know. One of the main things I want you to think about with this landscape painting is to really pay attention to dark and light, near and far, bright to dull, creating space through progressively duller colors, creating foreground space with very bright shades. I don't care if it's a super naturalistic composition, but I do care that that warm to cool, bright to dull is present in your painting. Also, think about ways that you can pre-mix your colors before you begin. It will help you move away from your colors being all one shade or being too close to the colors that come out of the tube. It will create more vivid combinations if you take the time to pre-mix your colors for like 15 or 20 minutes before you begin. I also recommend painting on site, meaning going outside. If you don't have a professional easel, you can actually use a chair. Set the chair in front of you and tape your masonite board to the chair. Put a piece of plastic over the top of the chair. If you're painting outside with your coat, pull some plastic bags over your coat sleeves up to your wrists. That'll help kind of create plastic gaiters to keep you clean. Use your styrofoam plates when you're outside, and also don't forget to take some masking tape or something like that. It'll be a really fun experience to go paint in the setting where you're planning to have your image come back. Paint loosely, paint fast, and use sgraffito if you're trying to organize your structure of things or if you want to create a linear element.
All right.